Okay, we're now live and we're recording. Good afternoon, everyone. I think this is our 7th or the 8th in our series of webinars that we've been doing for families and for other professionals about just different areas that impact us, not just during COVID-19, but in our families. And today we have with us Dr. Susan Fletcher, who's a psychologist in Plano, and her topic today is parental alienation. And first of all, Dr. Fletcher, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and tell the others that are listening just where you're from, what you do?
Sure. I have a clinical practice that for over 20 years was in Plano, and I just recently moved to Frisco. So sometimes I say I have a practice in Plano too, and I have to correct myself because it's new for us. So we're in Frisco, and I have been providing therapy in the community for a really long time and assessments. And now a majority of what I do is forensic in nature. So child custody evaluations, psychological evaluations. I'm appointed to do family therapy or reunification therapy or individual therapy in different family law cases. I also dabble a little bit in doing personal injury. It just kind of helps the balance a little bit. So mostly assessments at this point, as well as expert testimony.
Okay, so I know you deal with reunification therapy a lot, which comes up in a lot of cases where there's parental alienation. So let's talk a little bit about what is parental alienation, what it is not, because I think that term is usually used sometimes.
Right. I think it's misused a lot of times too, because it seems to be trendy, or maybe the spirit of the times right now, to talk about that in a lot of cases where it may not accurately portray what's going on in a family. So what we're looking at with alienation is we're looking at a family, typically one that's in a separation or divorce stage, maybe in a modification stage, where there are disruptions in the agreed upon parenting plan. So there's what we call a resistance or refusal dynamic happening between the children and one of the parents. And traditionally, people have looked at it as a way to blame people, which would be inappropriate. I don't necessarily believe it's something where we're trying to find fault as much as assist the family as a whole to be able to have success with the parenting plan and improve relationships.
Okay, well, what if you say, for example, you have a situation where a parent's just been absent on their own and maybe has not been real involved in the child for whatever reason, and it's through no one's fault, but maybe that parent's. And
right. Well, yeah, I think that's a example of something else we see with families that are possibly in the divorce stage, and that would be called estrangement. And that's because there is a specific reason or a number of reasons why the children may be resisting or refusing being with that parent. Sometimes it's because of abuse. Sometimes it's because of substance abuse. Sometimes it's because there was an event that occurred that the kids are scared. So it could be justified more in estrangement. When we're looking at alienation or resistance refusal, where there isn't a reason that has a lot of data to support it, where there's unjustified reasons from children resisting or for children resisting being with a parent, that's when we're looking more at the extreme of alienation. So it's really about irrational beliefs and rational beliefs when it comes down to it. But I want to be real clear that it doesn't only happen in families where there's a divorce or separation. It can happen in intact families too, for a variety of reasons. So that's one of the reasons I believe that parental alienation is so misunderstood, is because there's so many little variables to look at, that it's not just if these 3 things are happening, then it must be alienation.
Okay, or if this is not happening, then it can't be alienation.
Absolutely correct, yes.
Are there some behaviors that are big red flags for parental alienation?
Well, I can speak about behaviors that are red flags for mental health professionals when we're looking at alienation, more than speaking related to what attorneys may see, because as a mental health professional, what we typically will see when alienation is present is that, again, there's unjustified reasons for the resistance refusal. I've had cases where children may say, he doesn't have good snacks, that's why we don't go over there. Or, he doesn't ever feed us. Well, when you start to get more information, you find out he doesn't feed fast food. or she doesn't feed fast food, and that's could be unjustified for the behavior. So we're going to look at irrational beliefs. We're going to look at unjustified behavior. One of the things we see a lot when alienation is a possibility is that the children start to call the other parent or the rejected parent, start to call that person by their first name, which is disrespectful, but also one of the ways that they may try to make their point across to the rejected parent. You also will see that the children and the parent have in the past had a good relationship. Maybe they used to go fishing, or the parent used to coach the sport team. There's a lot of evidence, pictures, there's a lot of information that says that they previously had a really good relationship. But now the children may be denying that there ever was a good previous relationship. So again, you're going to look at the bigger picture. And I think one thing to point out when we're talking about behaviors as it relates to alienation is we're going to look at the whole family. It's not an evaluation of the children only, and it's not an evaluation of what we call the favored parent only. The parent that a lot of times gets accused of coaching the children. It's not looking at that individual or looking at the parent who may be rejected. We have to look at the whole family about the dynamics of how they interact with each other.
And so, for example, I guess what you're saying is you may have grandparents that play into the story or further reinforce the negative beliefs, or maybe an aunt or uncle or other loved ones. That creates an environment where that's reinforced for the child.
Absolutely. It could even be another sibling that reinforces that because there might be some secondary gain. You know, all of us, intact families and families that operate in two households, see where kids can split parents. You know, I remember growing up that when I would come home from college, my dad would give me $20 and say, "Don't tell your mother," and my mother would give me $20 and say, "Don't tell your father." And so I loved it. And even as a college student, I loved the fact that I could do that with each, and that they I should ask, maybe they did know they were doing that. But you know, it is developmentally something we see that is expected and part of development for kids to try to split their parents, whether there's a divorce or not. But they have to learn that they can't do it, because we don't want them to take that kind of coping mechanism into adulthood, into a workplace, into their own relationships as they go forward, because that's not healthy. And so I want to make the point that just the fact that a child may be trying to split parents in two separate households doesn't mean it's alienation, and doesn't mean that's a bad child. It means that's an opportunity for some intervention. Whether a therapist is needed or not really depends on how severe and how much it interferes with healthy functioning. But those are the things that have to be attended to. And sometimes there are, as you said, Sharon, there are people that are part of the family, maybe not the nuclear family, that might promote that, and that can add to the problem.
Well, and it's occurred to me when you said that the child will have one time have had a really good relationship with the rejected parent and now denies that it existed. What about this thing that goes on where you've got a child, like for example, growing up in my parents, I could see the good and bad in each of them. And I
Right.
want my children to say there's good things about me, and there are probably things, I know there are things that they're like, that's not so great. And the same thing about their father, but you acknowledge that both exist together, because we all have good traits and bad traits. How the alienated child, how are they able to do that? Or are they?
So it's one of the things that stands out a lot to mental health professionals, attorneys, and judges, is when a child says one parent is all good, does nothing wrong, and the other parent does everything wrong and there's nothing good, because that's not realistic. To your point, we all have good traits and bad traits. So it's really when there's this polarization of the parents. And I've had a case in the past, and I know we're not going to get case specific at all, so I'm going to change one of the pieces of the example. But I had a child I was working with. She was 14 or so, and she was upset with her father because he was stalking her. And as I started to ask questions, she described that he would come to football games and he would watch her cheer. And as I started to ask more questions, I found out he was one of 1,000 people that came to that football game, that he never interacted with her, he didn't approach her, that he sat with her brothers and who also watched her cheer. And so she was not having a problem with her brothers watching cheer, but she had a real problem with the dad doing it, and even called it stalking, even though that's behavior he had had ever since she started cheerleading at the age of 4. So as I started to ask more questions, I saw those irrational beliefs, and that was something that would be considered good parenting for a parent to support their child, but she could only see it as a bad thing. And her mother had not attended very many of the games for a variety of reasons, and she didn't see that as bad as at all. So it's that polarized thinking, all good, all bad, that is one of the first places for intervention, not because I'm going to try to convince a child one parent is better than the other. That's not what the goal is, but it's to be able to acknowledge and be aware and acknowledge their own irrational beliefs, and learn to start to question themselves with some of the things that they say, and give them the opportunity to see other ways of looking at it. And I also want to say, when we're looking at alienation as a dynamic, and we're looking at the behaviors and traits, many times it's easy for somebody to start looking at the motivation for why. So especially in a divorce situation, people start talking about, well, the mom's doing this for this reason, or the dad's doing it for that reason. It's really important not to get stuck in that, because that doesn't benefit the family. We have to focus on the behaviors. We have to focus on ways to help families adjust their behaviors for the potential for healthier relationships over time.
And the why behind it isn't as important as the impact that it's having on the child.
Correct. And a majority of the time, the why is really about the parents' relationship with each other. It's about the conflict that existed and the disagreements between the two of them while they were married. And many times the reason they're not married anymore, they have trouble getting along. They don't see things the same way. They question each other. They try to regulate each other. And I also try many times when I'm doing therapy, when I have people in therapy, in reunification therapy, to help them understand that when they stay stuck in that conflict, they stay stuck in the why, they try to regulate the other parent, really what's happening is all the energy is going between the parents. And so it's a co-parenting conflict, and the child goes somewhat unattended with the attention of the parents. So many times that conflict between the parents is at the expense of that parent being able to do a good job and be a healthy parent in the way they're parenting their child. And those are the things that disrupt families. You know, alienation, estrangement, those things typically are unhealthy alignments in the family, where the kids start to get in charge because the parents aren't doing a good job of managing things. And it's really when you disrupt that hierarchy and children begin to be more in control than the parents, it's where we really have concerns as it relates to kids about their own healthy development.
How does that affect their attachment?
It affects their attachment in a variety of ways. And when we look at the literature and studies that have been done, you know, first of all, what we find is most of the research shows that any conflict with the parents that they're having is many times at the expense of the child, because the child's not getting their needs met. They may not get their emotional needs met. And when there's a lot of conflict like that, many times those children go on to have behavior problems. So how it affects attachment and emotional development is it leaves some of those things unattended, in that the child is trying to manage their own emotional security. And many times, especially in young kids, they're going to do it in really unhealthy ways. They're going to do it in ways that aren't well developed, because they're really left on their own to try to get some emotional security. And one of those healthy ways is to choose one parent over the other. And that's difficult because it's at the expense of their development and their relationship with the other parent. But if the parents aren't behaving themselves, they're not getting along well, and they're exposing their children to that conflict, kids have to feel like they have to take care of themselves, and they're trying to control the parents as a way to manage what's going on with them. So attachment gets disrupted in a way because the hierarchy in the family gets disrupted.
Okay. What are some of the effects that you see commonly on children long term?
Mhm. So that's a more difficult one, because when you look at the research, we really can't say all kids that are in families where behaviors suggestive of alienation are occurring go on to do poorly. We really can't say that, and I think that's the good news.
Mhm.
But we can say that what the research shows is when these dynamics go on in families over time, those kids go on to have more difficulty as adults in relationships. They tend to love differently. They tend to see the world a little differently. They have some trust issues at times. But the way I talk about it with families is that what it does is it gives children a bad toolbox to take into adulthood. And we all will prefer that children go into adulthood with healthier toolboxes. So it's really a matter of skills and tools to be able to learn how to manage things. So for instance, when alienation is occurring and the behaviors we've already talked about are present in a family, that many times that's what leads to a cutoff. And so what I get concerned about is the effect on a child is they learn the way to solve a problem is just cut somebody off, and or just stop working on it or blame the other person and don't take responsibility. So those are unhealthy tools in the toolbox. And what we know is as people go on to be adults, that when they are in a work environment, one of the main reasons people lose their jobs most often is because they can't get along versus because they can't do the job. So we want all of our kids to enter into adulthood with healthier toolboxes so they can be productive and they can be contributors and not be the ones that are having trouble getting along.
Right. And there's also a sense of entitlement or the potential for that. Like, most of us as family law attorneys and those of us who are listening that have court orders, the court orders kind of dictate our lives and the child's life for a while. But if there is a court order that says there will be visitation between the parent, and then you inject into that this level of alienation, what does that tell the child about authority?
Well, there's a lot of ways to look at that. And so because I'm a mental health person, I'm looking at it in terms of development a little bit more than maybe an attorney might. But what concerns me is that many times kids feel they don't have to obey court orders, especially if they have a parent who is allowing them to make the choice about whether they see the other parent or not, despite what the court order says. And so I've actually, in my office, as I'm sure many attorneys and other people that do the work I do have had happen, I have children say, just get me in front of the judge, because as soon as he hears from me, he's going to know it's not the right thing for me to go and see that other parent, and that I'm better off with my mom or I'm better off with my dad. They feel empowered for some of those decisions. And unfortunately, when an evaluation is done or more data is available, you see that that can be reinforced by the favored parent. Something when you talk about entitlement that's really concerning to me is when I'm talking to a teenager, especially, and that teenager is trying to convince me that the favored parent isn't telling them what to do. In fact, I've had teenagers say to me, Dr. Fletcher, I want you to know my mom's not doing this. It's my choice. She told me it's my choice whether I go see my dad or not, or whether I go see my mom or not. And they don't even realize when they're saying that they're telling me something that's really concerning, that one of the parents is telling a child that it's their choice, despite a court order, about whether they go to the other parent's house or not. And they think they're really trying to prove that their parent's not doing something wrong. In a mental health setting, it's really, in my opinion, not proving who's doing something wrong, but it's looking for the opportunity to get them moving forward in a healthier fashion. But unfortunately, what you and I know is litigation, adults, especially in litigation and family law, they're always trying to defend themselves and prove something. And many times that becomes their first language in their families too. And it's at the expense of figuring out where do we agree and where can we move forward at times. So in reunification therapy, there are times I will meet with both parents to give them feedback, both parents, to give them feedback about their children, because I want to make sure they have the same information from me and give them the opportunity to exist together as co-parents as we're talking about ways to improve this dynamic. And all the time, I'm going to tell you, every single time, I'm having to stop them and get them out of the habit of defending and giving the 50 reasons why and wanting to send me copies of emails and text messages to prove what they're saying. But really by the time they've come to reunification and they're court ordered, all of that decision making has already been made, and my job is to assist them to be healthier with healthy toolbox going forward.
Right. So the decision's been made. There's
Absolutely.
going to be reunification. It's just how we structure it going forward. It
Right.
would seem to, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to your point, many times it's the child too that I'm having to say the decision's been made, and I'll draw a timeline on my dry erase board, and because they're still in the decision making mode as a child, because they feel like they want access to the judge, and if they did, the judge would listen to them. And what we all know is that the hardest part is when a child may give their opinion and then they aren't in agreement with whatever the judge or a mediated settlement agreement is, that they feel that they weren't heard even though they spoke up, and we have to deal with that. So for me, when I'm working with kids who are still stuck in that decision-making mode, my job is to listen, to try to meet them where they are, but help them understand that at this point in time, I can help them figure out how to make this work. And the more we start getting into the decision-making mode, that child may lose some credibility with one of the parents at least, or there could be some non-compliance. And I'm going to want to do that, and any reunification therapist is going to want to do that in a way that isn't shaming and blaming of a child, but it certainly does cause a little bit more anger, because they think I have access to the judge and they just have to tell me and then I'm going to call the judge. And we all know that isn't true.
Well, it seems to me that your role is a little different then. And if you could tell our listeners, because you're talking about reunification within the context of parental alienation, how does that differ from the child's therapist? Because I could see some therapists who might want to be, I have a social work background. You want to affirm your client. You want to meet them where they are. But I see that as a very different role from what you're talking about.
It is, and I think you just brought up a really good point that it's important for everybody to know, is that the skills that are needed by a clinician in a role as a reunification therapist are very different than the traditional roles we have seen from mental health professionals. So, a reunification person is neutral, and they may be perceived as not being neutral by the favored parent, because the reunification person is trying to follow through with the court order and help the family comply in a healthy fashion. It many times to the favored parent looks like the reunification therapist is aligned with the rejected parent, and the children may think that too. So a reunification therapist needs to have additional skills beyond what are expected in typical therapy. It's conflict resolution. It's in reunification, you're not working on the marriage. The marital issues bleed into a lot of this stuff, but it isn't talking about the reasons they divorce. It's really not the relationship between the parents and what got them there as much as it is looking at what their skill set is. In reunification therapy, another thing that is different is that I am going to meet the parents first, because I want to hear what their narrative is individually, and then I'm going to meet the child. And then most of the appointments, the goal is that most of the appointments are with the child and the rejected parent. So those are called joint appointments. That's what we call them in our office, because I want to assist them to be able to deal with some of those relationship dynamics. Many times in reunification, I'm going to tell you the kind of cases that I tend to get. There is a need for an individual therapist for at least one of the parties, because after I start doing the joint sessions, that child only has access to me one-on-one for a brief period of time at the beginning of the joint session, and they need somebody that they can go complain to about the reunification process. They need somebody that can help them with their anxiety in the reunification process. And also there's things I'm going to notice about that child and about the parent in the reunification process that I think needs to be dealt with. The most common one in reunification is the favored parent trying to regulate the other parent to parent differently, trying to tell them what to do in their household. And I have to try to help them be able to focus on parenting the child with coping with disappointments about missing a birthday party because they're going to be having dinner that night with a parent, or whatever it is. And so that parent, the favored parent, may need individual therapy, to have somebody give them their full attention to be able to talk to them about the reasons why that may be interfering with their parenting. And the goal is really to assist your child to learn how to cope with some of the improvements and some of the changes that are happening in the family.
Well, how do we get here? I mean, what are some dynamics or some behaviors within the family system that contribute to alienation?
Well, so some of the behaviors, I mean, that's such a big question that contribute to alienation, because I know we've already talked about behaviors that we typically will see when alienation is occurring. So more of those behaviors would be those irrational beliefs, and more of them would be a parent supporting a child making a choice that's against court orders. You also will see, if there's a family of 2 or 3 kids, maybe more children, you'll see that each child may have a different kind of relationship with each parent. So it's not like that subset of children all believe things in the same way. One may have more difficulty. And what research shows us is that a vulnerable child, so a child with learning disabilities, a child with ADHD, a child with an anxiety disorder anyway, just in general, those we look at as more vulnerable children. They seem to be the ones that, when alienation is occurring, tend to suffer the most and tend to have the most difficulty, as opposed to a child who's more resilient. Children who are more resilient kind of go, well, whatever. I mean, I'm going to be at my dad's on Thursday. I'll be at my mom's on Friday. And I just got to make sure I have my homework because I got to get all that done before Monday. And I want to be with my friends this weekend. They tend to be a little more resilient, and they tend to not have as much difficulty. So you can have that in the same family. And when you talk to the kids alone, it almost sounds like they're talking about totally different families, because their experience is different and what they bring to the family is different.
Well, and I guess I'm talking in terms about what behaviors on the part of other family members, say, for example, telling the child adult information or details about a court case, or maybe, removing favorite items that belong or remind somebody of the rejected parent from the home.
Right.
Are those the sorts of things that can contribute to alienation?
Yeah. And coaches sometimes too, who may not have all the information, may say, I can't believe why your dad takes you away from practice, and doesn't he know how much you love this sport? So there are stories we hear of one parent or grandparent taking a group picture of the family when they were intact, and then cutting somebody out of that picture and still displaying it on top of a piano or in a bookshelf. And so I don't ever say that I think that people are well-meaning when they do things like that, but I want to give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't recognize just how harmful the way they're taking out their own frustration and making their own statements as peripheral members of the family may interfere for that child. That's a message to the child of being a loyal soldier to one parent at the expense of the other. And so, we do see that. We see well-meaning friends too, and I will say well-meaning friends, but they may say things that just reinforce a negative narrative about
Right.
one of the parents. So it's hard. And as a custody evaluator, when I'm doing evaluations, I have to figure out, okay, who do I want to get information from? And I get information from the parties about who they want me to interview about information that things that have gone on in the family or verified data. And there are many people who will start to say something to me when I'm interviewing them about one of the parents. And then and I've already asked them, have you ever met that parent? No, but I heard it from the other parent that he was abusive, that he did this, or I heard from the other parent that she was manipulative, but they don't have firsthand knowledge, and they may be providing that information to other children that are giving it to the children in the family. So it's just one of those things, we see arrows all over the place, and we just see it just takes on a life of its own, this narrative that people may believe for whatever reason, and that really does affect the child. When all of us are raising children, we are raising the parents of our grandchildren.
That's true.
And so they're learning parenting from the way they're parented. And yes, there's a lot of other variables that will influence somebody's parenting, but that's the part that's concerning, is different generations can get involved in this. And then at a certain point, what does it start to look like? And you and I have had the conversation before about, and I'll just say, because you and I have been in this community for a long time, and I've practiced for over 20 years, that, we get to see what some of these cases look like later. And I've had situations where I've gotten Christmas cards, or I've gotten wedding announcements, and people have contacted me through social media or different ways, and they'll say, we haven't seen you in about 10 or 15 years, and that was a really difficult time for us, but I want to show you this. Here's my mom, here's my dad on my wedding day, and they both walked me down the aisle. That sometimes as children get older, and that's what we see is a trend that happens, and they get out of the family system, they go to college, start to have their own relationships, they start to view the problem differently. And many times you may see at that point that healing may occur between the rejected parent and that child, because that child starts to have more experience, might get away from some of that negativity from other family members, and then they start to make up their own mind and question some of the things they believed. And that's hard for a rejected parent to hear, whether it's the mother or the father, because they don't want to wait that long, and that's not a guarantee. And so I'm always trying to help them at least plant the seeds for a child to know, when they look back, a little bit more information that's appropriate. And that's really tough, because we all want immediate gratification. And, I get parents that call and they say, I haven't seen my child in 4 years, and you've been appointed to work on our case. And I don't talk to them, my office manager does, but Dr. Fletcher's been appointed on my case, and can we get started today? And there's a process that happens before we get started that can happen in a timely manner if everybody turns everything in on time and in a timely manner. And we go to get started, and it's never fast enough for the rejected parent, and it always feels like it's too fast for the other parent. And so I'm always trying to help them understand this is the pace we want to go through. And then I also get people that say, I haven't seen my child in a week. Can we get started today? Because, and I'm always going to give grace and be respectful, because it feels like a long time, no matter what it is. That's one of the things about early intervention I want to also make sure that we mention today, is that the earlier we start to work with families, that reunification therapists start to work with families when there's resistance refusal, the better outcome we're going to have. The longer it goes on, and the more of a break between a family member and their children, a parent and their child, it's a little harder to overcome, but it can be overcome. But early intervention is key. Having a reunification therapist who is getting the training from reputable sources like AFCC and a number of other organizations about the literature and research on alienation and resistance and refusal. Peer consultation. I'm going to tell you, this work gives me gray hair. This work, reunification, I come home some days and it's tough, because people don't appreciate the fact that a reunification therapist is going to assist someone they just divorced in having a better relationship with the kids. And you have to have thick skin with this. And yet the reason most of us do this work is because we do see success in reunification therapy. And it doesn't have to be at the expense of one of the parents, but we do see people improve. I did a video joint session yesterday with a family where one of the parents hadn't seen the child in 1.5 years. And I had seen them each individually a number of times before this joint appointment occurred. And I would prefer to always do those in person, but sometimes there's a reason, especially during a pandemic, why you might do it on video. And so it was really a beautiful thing to watch, because the parent was able to give empathetic responses. That parent was able to meet the child where they were and talk about the here and now and going forward. And that's not how that parent presented the first time I met them. And so when I saw, when that parent was talking that way to their child, how the child responded, and it was almost like fertilizer on a Gerber daisy, because the child just lit up and was able to continue to talk and wasn't trying to get an agreement. They just wanted to be heard, and they wanted to know, going forward, can it be different? And so as a reunification therapist, my job is to prepare them for those joint appointments, and then in those joint appointments to assist them to communicate more effectively. And then let's just be honest, my job is to work myself out of a job. I don't want a family to be so dependent on someone like me to help them communicate that they have to see me to deal with difficulties. This isn't about resolving issues in reunification. It's about repair attempts. It's about damaged relationships and realignment to be able to help people have healthier relationships with each other going forward. So I'm teaching them the skills in their toolbox that are basically repair attempts. And that is empathetic responses, listening to understand versus listening to respond, being able to meet somebody where they are and move forward rather than rehash an argument from 6 years ago. That's not productive. And we many times are saying, well, we're never going to resolve that issue because you have very different experiences with that. And yet I need a parent to be able to acknowledge that the child was hurt and their feelings were hurt and that was upsetting for them, and to be able to apologize for that, but not necessarily admitting something they feel they didn't do. And that requires a different level of skill. So I just want to add that I think well-meaning therapists who want to help families many times will take on some of these cases where allegations of alienation are present and they want reunification therapy, and they're not quite ready as a therapist to do that because you're going to get shot at a whole lot. And I don't mean literally, but you're going to have really good procedures and really set some really strong expectations to keep the proper boundaries so that you don't become part of the problem, and you have to be able to handle it when the amount of conflict pointed at you comes. And you have to be able to handle children who many times can look like they're oppositional defiant, but they're really just scared and angry. And you have to give them grace, and you have to give them time. And it's a lot of balls to hold up at one time. But it's doable if you know the literature and you have peer support. I have a lot of people in this community and communities outside of Texas that I'll staff cases with, and to make sure I'm moving in the right direction. And you need it because it's tough work.
What about, we've talked a lot about, the rejected parent wants to come in and tell their story because they feel victimized. I've represented them. They feel victimized.
Right.
And it's really hard to resist getting sucked into that story. Like, let's just move forward. But what about when you still have the favored parent that's in the picture and dealing with their attempts to maybe sabotage the reunification or continue their alienating behavior in the family? So how do we deal with that?
So first, I want to address the first thing you said. Let's just be upfront that many, many people that are in reunification or where alienation is occurring have experienced real trauma. I mean, so I don't even want to say it's subjective trauma. That's their story. That's what they believe. And what's difficult is that in reunification therapy, I am not going to address a lot of their trauma. That would be for an individual therapist to assist them with. But they feel that that is one of the things I need to know everything, read the 3 child custody evaluation reports that were done, the 4 psych evals of the psychologists that didn't agree with the diagnoses. And at a certain point, I'm going to want somebody to pick and choose the most representative information that I need, but I'm not going to question the trauma as a reunification therapist. I'm going to assist with the moving forward of it. An individual therapist will assist with that trauma. So I've got to be aware, and it's a very common thing, I've got to be aware that this person in the marriage felt traumatized by the other person, but I have to teach them how to separate that for the benefit of the children to be able to have some kind of a relationship with that other parent. Because as you and I already said today, the decision's already been made for the parenting plan. And so we have to be able to move forward with that. So it's a fine line, because I don't want to dismiss the trauma. I don't want to dismiss all those bad things that happen and why they're divorced, but that's not the arena in reunification therapy to deal with it. So I have to help them separate it. And that's where, you said it earlier, that's where unfortunately a lot of kids are exposed to adult data that they've been given a custody evaluation report to read, or psych eval, or they've been told things, and sometimes it's not accurate. And I have to figure out, what do I do with that? What I don't do with that is start trying the case in a mental health professional's office. That's not what you do. what we're going to do is we're going to start assisting with the skills that go in your toolbox to be able to manage those things. And I have seen men and women both who have both experienced trauma in the marital relationship, trauma very real to them, very hurtful to them, be able to overcome that for the best interest of their children and actually be able to be in the office together with the other parent, knowing I'm going to control the situation to the best of my ability. Now, if we're talking about physical abuse and things like that, that's a whole nother level that we're not going to get into today, but we're talking about the emotional trauma, somebody cheated on the other person, or, all those things that we know can happen for marriages to end. So I'm going to try to move that forward, knowing that trauma is present, but try to help them separate that to move forward so that the children can have a relationship with both parents. And what the research shows and what kids will say over time is they want a relationship with both parents. The goal is for both parents to exist in their life. And they don't necessarily have to like each other, but it's really, existing in their life, on their wedding day, on the graduation day, when they get an award for playing football. All those things, we want them to feel as if they both can coexist. And that's really what I'm asking parents to learn how to do when they're not capable yet.
Are there some times, though, where there may be, say, the favored parent has such firmly held irrational beliefs about the other parent that it makes the reunification process impossible, if not just extremely difficult? What do you do in those circumstances?
Yes, so those are very common circumstances, and anybody that does this work will tell you they always have one case that just is stuck there for a long period of time. And unfortunately, what that leads to is non-compliance of a court order too, and that's not my arena, that's an attorney's arena to deal with. But with those very strong irrational beliefs, that's where I'll make a referral for individual therapy. And if that parent is already in individual therapy, but I don't believe that therapist is adequately addressing some of those things, and sometimes we get concerned that they may make a judgment about the other parent they never met, like he's a narcissist or she's borderline, and so if that therapist, in my opinion, I say it straight up, becomes that individual therapist for that one parent is part of the problem, because they're reinforcing those irrational beliefs and they're just adding more energy to the polarization in the family. For whatever reason, then I will make a suggestion many times to the court or to the attorneys first to be able to replace that individual therapist with someone who's better trained to manage that, because that's not in the best interest of the family for somebody to be reinforcing irrational beliefs. I've had it happen where a mother was telling her individual therapist all these things that were being said in reunification that were not being said in reunification, were being said by the amicus, and there was just all this splitting going on, and the individual therapist believed every bit of it. And when I called her to consult with her early in the case, she was pretty upset with me because she felt like, I didn't have any morals, and that she wanted to know if I got my degree online. And I mean, it was just, it came with such venom that as I started to listen to her, and I had to practice what I try to help other people do, and we started to talk, what I found is that she had a lot of information that was misinformation, and including police reports and records and stuff. And so it concerned me, because I felt at that point it would be hard for her to turn around. And then once she had information, she didn't get it from me, but she got it from another source. She dismissed herself because she said, I feel like at this point it's hard for me to know. And I want the person I was treating to have the best possible opportunity to learn how to control her own irrational beliefs. And I'm going to tell you, I have a lot of respect for that therapist, because that's what we all should do. We should check ourselves. We should consult with peers. We should read literature. We need to always revise our policies. Almost probably 3 times a year, we put something else in my treatment agreement, because we'd learned something that if we'd had that in the treatment agreement, it would have helped everybody. Mark Twain once said, all conflict is due to unmet expectations. So all conflict is due to unmet expectations. A reunification therapist needs to set appropriate expectations of what the role is for everybody to help heal the family. And by doing that, then I think that's one of the ways we can assist to not be part of the conflict and be able to keep it down. And to me, that's, Sharon, that's what a court order does too.
Right.
But I also realize that that's something that's difficult for many litigants to deal with, because the outcome that led to that court order isn't what they wanted, and they still haven't been able to wrap their head around it. Again, that's going to be an individual therapy issue rather than a reunification issue.
Well, and I think we as family law attorneys also need to check ourselves, because we, whether we're representing a favored parent or rejected parent, we need to be able to step back and objectively look at this. First of all, it's not our family, not our monkeys, not our circus, not our monkeys, as that's what it's called.
Right.
It's not.
Yeah.
But we have a responsibility to our clients to not harm them any further. And if we are reinforcing, if we are taking actions that are reinforcing those irrational beliefs, then we're contributing to the problem. That's my view. And
right.
So it's a constant check on yourself. What is real, what is not. And if you represent the rejected parent, it's like you hear all the time, this isn't fair. She said this about me. He said this about me. I've been falsely accused, and they want justice. Well, we're not probably going to get it, but we can get solutions going forward.
Right.
You're never going to undo it. So we're starting to get some questions. And is it okay if I start asking you some of the questions? Because we've got
Sure. I have one point I want to make about attorneys, though, because I hope all attorneys feel the same way you do. But in the role that I play, especially many times I'm providing testimony about reunification therapy that's occurred in a family, I'm a guest in the courtroom. I'm not an attorney. I'm a mental health professional. And so I'm in the arena that is not my arena. It's a law arena. And yet I also am very comfortable in that arena. But I always have to remember that an attorney is representing their client. And so
Right.
even though I may not agree with the client, I may think they're part of the problem, I always am aware that they're representing their client in the way
Absolutely.
they see that's best, even if they make it harder. And I think that there's some problems, because that's really what the role of the attorney is. And so I know I'm just going to answer the questions that are asked of me, do the best job. And where I get most frustrated as a mental health professional is when a lot of the retainer that's provided to me is used for attorney correspondence, because I have to correspond if attorneys come to me. And that happens in a lot of cases. I want it to be used for the actual therapy and the joint appointments. I get frustrated when I have to have too many individual appointments with people to get them ready before I do the joint appointment. And that's where people like me start to make referrals for individual therapy, is because we want to get at getting the parent and that child in the room together to start dealing with things, not too soon, not too late, but it's a team approach. It's a system approach. And so we're going to try to do what we think is best for the family. And that is really to get some joint appointments going and moving forward.
And and I agree with you. And I think as lawyers, I think we first and foremost do have a duty to represent our clients, but we're also counselors. I mean, my license is attorney and counselor at law. And so, but I think just keeping ourselves informed about what is alienation, because I think it's a term that's thrown around that is to describe things that really aren't true alienation. Because on the cases that I've had that have involved alienation, I mean, you're actually talking about changing the worldview of a kid. I mean, it's that extreme. And so it's almost a little bit of a deprogramming, but sometimes less, sometimes more. But it's really just getting to what it really is and recognizing it. Before I open it up to questions, I wanted to ask you one other thing about a timeline. I mean, we want the best possible outcomes for these families. Are there ages that we could intervene in that if you wait too long, it's really less optimal? And what is that age that we're looking at?
So that's a great question, because there's a wonderful article by Kelly and Johnston that talked about they describe the difference between alienation, estrangement, and they also quote literature about moral development. And one of the things we know is when kids get to be about 10, 11, and 12 is when they can become more of a loyal soldier. They start to choose sides. Kids younger than that, just developmentally, they tend to kind of forget they're supposed to hate a parent, or they kind of forget, that they're not supposed to act like they're having fun, because they can be in the moment more. And as they get a little older, they start to choose sides as a way many times to manage the emotional anxiety that they feel, because it's just easier to choose one over the other instead of trying to do that. Kids have that problem with best friends too. Sometimes a child's best friend doesn't like the other best friend, and many times they have unhealthy coping mechanisms. They might say, well, I'm not going to have a birthday party because they don't get along, and so it's just easier not to have a birthday party because I don't want to deal with their conflict. We'll take that one step further when that happens in a family. And so we usually start seeing more of that about the ages 10, 11, or 12. So especially with families with younger children, it's important to get early intervention, try to get some of those things going, and not wait too long when it's an adolescent because of what we know happens.
Okay, well, I'm going to start on a couple of the questions. One of our listeners has said, what are some ways that a favored parent can help their child who is showing signs of alienating the other parent if neither parent is able to afford therapy or counseling? How can the parent who the child currently feels open and honest with help the child break down their irrational thoughts and help establish a better relationship?
Okay, Sharon, I love that question. I love that question because that favored parent may have more credibility than the rejected parent. And there's a lot of really good books out there. One's by Darnall, it's Beyond Divorce Casualties and Divorce Casualties, that can go into it more for someone who can't afford therapy or wants to try to do some of these things on their own. There's some really good concrete examples, but I'll give you one right now. And one of those concrete examples is to give empathetic responses to your child, but also say, this is what we're going to do is that Friday you're spending time with, let's say it's a father. So Friday you're going to spend time with your father. And so what can I do as your mom to help you as you get ready to go do that? Because I know you've got some difficulty in the relationship. So, whether it's a coach or a teacher, when your child has difficulty in a relationship, your goal as a parent should try to help them have the skills to cope with that and encourage them and guide them rather than calling the coach, the teacher, or the parent and telling them how to change their behavior, because that doesn't necessarily always work out the way you would like it to. So give them the coping skills, help them feel heard. But if your child didn't want to go to school, and said, I don't want to go to school because I didn't prepare for a test, my guess is you're not going to coddle them and keep them home and let him have ice cream. What you're going to do is say, the expectation is you're going to go to school today, and I know that you're not ready, and that must make you really scared. So in the car, why don't we do a little bit of quizzing, and then when you're done today, let's kind of prepare for the next time. You use those same dynamics, you display those same dynamics as a parent with your child when it comes to resistance refusal too.
The name of that book is Beyond Divorce Casualties, and we'll put, with this post, we'll put a list of resources out there. So if
that would be great. Another one is Divorce Poison by Rick Rorschach, and who's a local person who is known internationally, who's produced a lot of really good literature. But those are things that are for lay people that want to help within their families, that are easy to understand.
Okay, and then we have somebody that says, how severe does a situation have to be to recommend flipping custody and cutting off the favored parent? Is there a duty to try other remedies first?
Yeah, that is a last resort. And if you talk to most professionals that do this work, we're doing everything we can to prevent that. If possible, that's in the power of what our roles are, because that would be the outcome we're trying to avoid. So how we know when we do that is when the health and safety of a child is at risk, and it's not just a false allegation or an outcry, but it's also not the decision of one person. There's a lot that goes into that. So I'm asked that on the stand a lot. And my answer is it depends. And it depends on a lot of variables, because we don't want to teach kids the way you handle problems is you just cut it off. And probably all parties need some intervention to know how to best work together as a family system. Kids are a part of a family whether there's two households or not. The way they view family and their concept of it is based on their experiences. And so that would be a last resort, and that isn't a resort most people end up choosing.
Right. Well, it just reinforces the reverse of the problem that you came with, the cutting off. I mean, you've had the favored parent cutting off the rejected parent and encouraging that, and then the system then models that for the child, right, with the other parent.
But you and I know, Sharon, sometimes people will say, well, my daughter said she's going to kill herself if she has to go to her mom's this weekend. Okay, you know what you have to do first is try to get some stabilization for the child. We're not necessarily working on the relationship with the parent. We want to make sure that child is, whether they're at risk or not, get some healthy coping mechanisms in there. And those are unusual cases and usually attention seeking, but we don't want to make the mistake if it's not, if it's a real outcry.
Absolutely.
So the health and welfare of the child comes first, rather than the decision just to deny access.
Right, right. And I think that's what I was saying.
Yes.
So maybe I didn't say it articulately, but have you, somebody says, have you ever had to make a recommendation to award the alienated parent an extended exclusive possession due to the favored parent's irrational beliefs or sabotaging of the reunification process? So sort of like a temporary cooling off, or I don't know what else to call it.
So very briefly, first I'll add that mental health professionals do not make the decisions about children, that many times it's in the court arena where those decisions are made. And so if somebody's done a child custody evaluation, they're the only ones in the state of Texas that can make recommendations for that. They're not even making the actual ultimate decision. So you have to have enough data in order to make decisions about possession and access. And I know the attorneys know that, and the mental health professionals know that, but that's hard for litigants to understand. I think we have a little bit more power, but that is a mistake a lot of mental health professionals make, is they make possession and access recommendations when they really should not, and their license doesn't allow them to do that. So I have to say
And the family code doesn't either.
The family code will not allow you, and so that's the quickest way to get thrown off of working with a family. And so I think the original question was about making decisions about exclusive access. I'm not sure, I want to make sure I understood the rest of the question. I got sidetracked by that little tirade I gave you.
It sounds basically awarding the alienated parent extended exclusive possession, to the exclusion of the favored parent,
right?
Because of the sabotaging of the reunification process.
So I've seen that happen, and that happens not as the first thing that the court typically intervenes with. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on, but it is a last resort also. And then when it does happen that way, there's a lot of support that family needs, because it angers kids. You're taking them away from someone they see as a security blanket, putting them with someone they see as somebody to be feared. And so it's how it's done really that determines the opportunity for it to be helpful and healthy, rather than whether it's done yes or no. It's really how those things happen, just like how kids are told what the parenting schedule is that's going to be in a final trial of a court order. How they are told is maybe, in my opinion, more important than what the actual result is. Yeah, and a lot of times we just leave it up to, here's what it's going to be. All right, let's move forward. And the coping skills are not guided to be used appropriately by all parties in the family. So those transitions need some assistance.
We have another question about have you ever come across a parent who has admitted that he or she is the alienating parent? That would take a lot of self-awareness, right. I would think. And this person says they were a rejected parent who engaged a therapist who would not use the word alienation for fear that it would antagonize the alienating parent. And in the end, never solved it.
Yeah, well, that's like the word narcissist. People come in all the time in these cases and say the other person's a narcissist. I know what, I read the book and they meet every single criteria. Okay, I'm not going to get stuck on all those labels either. And I will use the term alienation, but I very quickly move to resistance refusal, because we're going to talk about the behaviors we're trying to assist with rather than labels for people, because we're going to be more successful when we look at it in terms of behaviors. So the answer to the first part of that question is yes, I do. And many reunification therapists and mental health professionals work with people who go, wow, I didn't know when I did that could be considered as alienation. No, I didn't. That never occurred to me. And those are called naive alienating behaviors. And Darnall's book, which you said you'll provide for people, the reference for that, they talk about different kinds of alienating behaviors, from naive alienators or alienating behavior to obsessive. So I do work with people that go, wow, that didn't occur to me. Like some parents will say, I just never say anything about the other parent. That's how I handle it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's not an alienating behavior. It's part of the picture many times when you see resistance.
It contributes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so
The kid
let's just
triggers the
acknowledge.
resistance.
Yeah. You don't say, what did you do at your mom's this weekend? Were you afraid? What you say is, what'd you have for dinner at your mom's this weekend? Because I'm going to make chicken. And if you've had chicken already, I'll go ahead and make something else. You have to allow the children to be able to see that you acknowledge the other parent coexist in their lives, but not at the expense of the relationship they're having with the other parent. So not saying anything just polarizes it, and kids start doing that too. And boy, we don't like it when kids do that when it's about home life and school life. They come home and act like nothing's going on. We want to be able to have open dialogue about things. We don't want polarization or, two different narratives and two different settings. So yes, we do see people with good self-awareness. It does require good self-awareness. It requires the ability to accept the feedback from someone like me. And so we're going to do, most of the people I know in our community that do reunification therapy, we're going to do the best job we know how in order to be empathetic, but also do our jobs and provide the kind of feedback that somebody needs to adjust their behavior. But let's be fair, a lot of people don't appreciate that feedback sometimes and would like to argue about it rather than take it constructively and move forward. And that's our job, is to assist them to do that.
Now, you said there's a naive alienator. What are the other types of alienators?
So Darnall talks about it as naive, talks about obsessive alienators. It's almost like a job. They gain so much energy doing that, and there's like a campaigning that's going on. And then I use the term of I'd say simple alienator, because it's somebody that they're just very, very consistent, and they don't have anything good to say, and they, provide information to children that really is adult information, and they might even use the child as a peer. They almost elevate them to peer status. And kids like that, and they want to know, and if you're willing to tell. But very briefly, I'll tell you, I have a concern about people who think kids deserve to hear the truth, because when we start telling kids what we perceive to be the truth about the other parents, it's traumatic to kids. So you have to look at that and say, okay, truth versus trauma. So maybe that's the agenda of a parent, to tell the truth because it makes them feel better, and they feel like the child deserves to know. But that parent, who many times may be seen as a person, behaving like an alienating person, many times that person's inducing even more trauma. And kids will tell us that. They'll say they asked their mom not to talk about it, or their dad not to talk about it, but they kept doing it, and they were curious to know, but now they wish they didn't have that information. So there's truth versus trauma, and what we need to recognize is many times what we want kids to know because we think they deserve to know or they should know is just re-traumatizing them. And that shouldn't be our goal. Our goal is to heal families, get them to move forward, help children to be able to have a relationship that's healthy with both parents, and move into adulthood with a good toolbox so that they have some good relationship skills as they go forward and don't repeat some of the patterns.
And are there some cases, I think you have to accept that there are some cases, especially an obsessive alienator, you're not going to change their belief system at times.
So you're going to teach the child how to cope with all of those things. And I'm going to tell you, many times when there is somebody who's very obsessive in their behaviors, when a parent is that way, kids will tell someone like me, I wish my mom or my dad would stop. But I told them that one time and I got in trouble, and they kind of retaliated. And so they're fearful of going up against that person. So then you've got a child who's just stuck, kind of feeling like emotionally they're raising themselves. And the person who's very obsessive doesn't believe it when you give them that feedback that their child has said, this is uncomfortable. They don't believe it. They think someone like me is making it up. And so it's a difficult dynamic to be involved with, but then we do our best to help somebody who's obsessive, but then we have to help the other parts of the system be able to have the skills to deal with that as if it never changes.
Right, because chances are that parent's still going to be, even if there was a custody flip, that parent's still going to have some involvement with the kid. If not now, once the child reaches adulthood, and seeks that other parent out.
Right. And one of the things, and I know we don't have time to explore a whole lot today, but I just want to mention that we also see parents who are the rejected parent who say, I give up. This is, they're trying to ruin me professionally. I've had, false allegations against me. I'm spending all this money I don't have. I'm borrowing from my parents. They're beating me down. I feel like giving up. Well, I'm never going to tell somebody to give up or not give up, but I'm going to say, you got to really figure out what your stamina is going to be and what the repercussions of that are. And if you need to take a break, that's one thing. And it's how you do it. Again, coming back to that rather than whether you take a break or not, because then kids many times feel rejected if one parent gives up because the conflict is just too horrible. The rejected parent just says, that's it. I don't want to see you this weekend, and let's just suspend any time we have together, because it just turns into something horrible. Well, that reinforces for the child that parent didn't really like them or care about them anyway or love them, and we have to be really careful about that, because that might be reinforced by the other parent. So I think Dr. Warshak's book is a really good one, Divorce Poison, in the sense that it addresses that very issue in one of the later chapters, where he talks about when there is an actual cutoff, or somebody takes a job out of the state where the primary family is. That happens, and sometimes it happens because it just becomes too difficult. Those are the cases that make those of us that do this work really, we struggle with, but we also know we can't save everybody, and we know where we end and the rest of the family begins. So we just have to give them the tools, give them the support, and then assist them to try to be resilient in the process, because it is a very difficult. I talk about how hard it is for the therapist. I don't want to miss the opportunity to say how hard it is on a family. It's very difficult on a family, and those of us that do this work need to always respect that.
And then somebody has said, I have alienated daughters who are now 18 and 21 and beyond the reach of the court. Is it time to give up? I would say it's never time to give up.
Never.
I mean,
yeah, it's just what you do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I know, and this is just anecdotal, but I've had people in my own caseload who themselves were the kids and they experienced that parental alienation where they had no relationship with one parent, and then after they reached adulthood, they started seeing things in a different perspective, and they reconnected with that parent and repaired that relationship. So I think there's always hope.
I always think there's hope, or I wouldn't do this work. And if I didn't see success with this, I wouldn't do this work. Even in the cases that are difficult, that, there's a lot of emails back and forth and a lot of other things happening. I have to tell you, I don't want to give up unless the court wants to make a change, because I think that we can continue to give families the opportunity to do it differently and continue to help what we all believe is in the best interest of children. And that is to have the opportunity for a relationship with both parents.
And I think we have one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Somebody has said, how can I be sure as a parent that I'm not being an alienating parent? So kudos to you for asking yourself that question, because that is a lot of self-awareness and takes a lot of just kudos to you for asking that. And my guess is if you're asking it, and acknowledging it, it could be, you're probably not, but thank you for asking that. She says, I'm very much a favored parent right now. She's only 9. I'm sure this will change. But currently my daughter has very much decided she does not want to visit her father, and he does not have love for her. I encourage her visits, and I explain that I desire for her to have a great relationship and that he indeed has love for her. I want to validate her feelings, but not encourage the irrational ones. How can favored parents check themselves to be sure they are indeed not being alienating?
So I love that question too. And sometimes that question comes up because somebody's been accused of it, even if it isn't an accurate accusal too. So I want to have a lot of respect for that, is that, first of all, get educated on it. And that's one of the reasons I've tried to give some additional resources here. But, parent your child. So whether you said you have a daughter, but anyone else that is watching this, focus on parenting. Focus on giving your child the skills they need in order to keep moving forward in the other relationship. Take the word father out of the question and put in there coach or teacher. If your child had a coach or a teacher that she didn't think was rooting for him, or didn't think was supporting them, or, you know, never called on him in class or whatever, you know, you would encourage her to have self-validation. You would encourage her in her internal dialogue to recognize that, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean the person doesn't care about them or doesn't wish them success, but it may mean that they have a different way of showing it. And so to be able to keep the child's own internal dialogue in check. So as a parent, it's important to say, you know, I know that here's a good way to say it is, I know that you may feel that your dad doesn't care about you. And that makes me sad that you may feel that way. So this feels very real, I'm sure. What I want you to know in all my conversations with your dad, I've always felt that he cares for you. I've always felt as if he looks out for your best interest. And so I want you to know we see it very differently, but I understand that you may not see it that way. You've got to be able to give those kind of messages. And when you do, what you're going to find is then kids are going to start to maybe keep themselves in check. You know, there's this thing called confirmation bias. We all have it. In a variety of arenas in our world. You know, if I say I don't like Brussels sprouts, and then we go to a restaurant and they're, you know, covered in cheese and all these other things, I might say, oh, I don't like Brussels sprouts, but I may have never tried them. I have to be open to not necessarily having my narrative stay the same. So I need to at least try it, and I may still not like it. But confirmation bias is where we already make up our mind despite other evidence that shows otherwise. And so that's our role, I believe, as parents in any situation, not just in a divorce situation or when there's alienation, is to challenge our kids in a very respectful way to be able to change their own narrative so that they don't just get pigeonholed that something is a certain way, because that's not a good life skill. We need to be open to things being different than we thought they may be. You know, how many, like my kids went to Pine Cove in the summer, and I remember the first time they were going, they're like, we're going to hate it. We're away from our friends. There's bugs. And yet I took them. And when they went, they loved it. And my older son became a counselor at Pine Cove between his freshman year of college and his sophomore year of college. And it's one of the greatest experiences he had, great learning opportunity. And so it's important to guide them in order to manage how they feel about something, but also allow them room to challenge their own narrative. And that's when you see some things start to change.
It seems to me that the task is the same, whether you think you may have some tendencies towards alienating or you're the rejected parent. It is to be very rational, matter of fact, and just just reinforce to the child, I'm here for you. This is what we're going to, and take the fight out of it. That's the kind of the bottom line.
Right. Take the conflict between the co-parents out of it and parent instead. So instead of conflicting, then you want to parent. And I draw that on my dry erase board for families all the time, because I think that many parents get stuck in a conflict, especially if they've been involved in litigation, and they come by that honestly. And so I have to help them shift their view from the co-parent and what they're doing wrong and what they should do differently and how to have a better relationship, to parenting the child to have the skills to deal with diversity of the kind of relationships they're going to have. And when we do that, we give our kids the greatest gift going forward, because we help them have a good box of tools as they go into adulthood, because they're going to be faced with conflict. They're going to not get the job they want, or not get the promotion they want. They have to learn how to be resilient and move forward anyway. So it's really focusing on parenting rather than focusing on the whole conflict. I wrote a parenting book called Parenting in the Smart Zone, and when I wrote that book, I wasn't doing as much of the litigation work, but I certainly was working with families very similar to the families I work with today. And I find that many times I'm still handing that parenting book to people saying, go to page 107 about the difference between discipline and punishment. And I do that because parenting is parenting, no matter if you've got conflict with a co-parent or you've got two separate households, that we have to come back to looking at what's our role, and our role is to assist our children to have the skills when they go forward. And they're not always going to be happy. A lot of people say, I just want my kids to be happy. Well, guess what? Sometimes we're not happy. and yet we've got to figure out how to cope with it and not have it define us or take us down. So it's really about parenting many times. And that's where the answer lies. And it's helping your child be able to cope with different situations, not at the expense of the other relationship.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. Someone has asked, will we be able to provide a recording? And we will be sending the recording out to Dr. Fletcher for her to link to her website. We will also have it linked to ours at www.beyondtherelationship.com. And Dr. Fletcher, what is your website?
It's FletcherPhD.com, and I have a blog on there, and so we'll be placing it on the blog.
Okay. I thank you so much today, Dr. Fletcher, for joining us. This has been very enlightening. If you had one best takeaway for all of us, I think you just said it, parenting is parenting, but is there any other one takeaway that you would give to all of us to make sense of all of this?
You know, I think it is to make sure that you don't impose your own agenda of conflict with someone else on your children. And if you can be honest with yourself to recognize, you know, when I do that, then it's at the expense of my relationship with my children. I think that would be one of the biggest takeaways from someone who's trying to figure out, okay, what's going on in my family and what role do I play? Or wondering why the kids continue to escalate and have difficulties when it's been suggested that alienation is going on. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways.
Okay. Well, again, thank you. Dr. Fletcher will have a link to this recording. I will on my website, which is www.ramagefamilylawfirm.com, as well as beyondtherelationship.com. Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Okay.